Okay, so now we get into the gospel passage, which again comes from Mark, chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. So it's a really long one, so you're just going to have to stick with it. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and he stayed close to the sea. One of the synagogue officials named Jairus came forward. Seeing him, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, saying, "My daughter is at the point of death. Please come lay your hands on her, that she may get well and live." He went off with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed upon him. There was a woman afflicted with hemorrhages for 12 years. She had suffered greatly at the hands of many doctors and had spent all that she had. Yet she was not helped, but only grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. She said, "If I but touch his clothes, I shall be cured." Immediately her flow of blood dried up. She felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Jesus, aware at once that power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who has touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to Jesus, "You see how the crowd is pressing upon you, and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. The woman, realizing what had happened to her, approached in fear and trembling. She fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be cured of your affliction." While he was still speaking, people from the synagogue official's house arrived and said, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" Disregarding the message that was reported, Jesus said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid, just have faith." He did not allow anyone to accompany him inside except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they arrived at the house of the synagogue official, he caught sight of a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. So he went in and said to them, "Why this commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they ridiculed him. Then he put them all out. He took along the child's father and mother and those who were with him and entered the room where the child was. He took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." The girl, a child of 12, arose immediately and walked around. At that they were utterly astounded. He gave strict orders that no one should know this and said that she should be given something to eat. Okay, great. So just to be clear, that it is possible that on Sunday, when you go to Mass, you won't hear the full reading here. It's optional that the priest or whoever's preaching or reading can cut out the story of the woman with hemorrhages. So that's an allowed thing. So if you get there and they don't read it, it's like, what the heck? Because there's kind of like, it does lose its train. In fact, this is something that is common with Mark's Gospel. It's kind of affectionately called a Markan sandwich, which is that it's a story within a story. So obviously we hear this, that there's the beginning of the story with Jairus and his sick daughter, and then it jumps with this story of the woman with the hemorrhages, and then like we lose track of like, wait, what's going on with the girl? So in other words, it's like it makes you want to either like keep reading, or maybe I guess you just jump ahead. But hopefully it's just like, I had to keep reading because like, let's just get through the story, and then we'll get to the girl, and then you finish with the story. So it's like a sandwich, so it's like you got the two pieces of bread and then the meat in the middle. So anyway, so that's an affectionate term given to this that Bible scholars that I listen to, that I pay attention to, talk about. Okay, anyway, so what's going on here? So Jesus comes to the other side, right? So this is actually remember last Sunday we heard about how they're going to the other side, and Jesus calmed the storm. Unfortunately, we skip something that when he gets to the other side, like he doesn't just go there aimlessly. He goes there for a purpose, and the purpose that is what? Is to cure a demoniac, to cast out a demon. So that's actually a pretty big deal. He's casting them out actually, and then from there, what happened? They actually beg Jesus to leave their district. This is kind of a wild thing. They see Jesus perform a miracle, and then they beg him to leave. So Jesus goes for this one thing. So it's like, you just imagine, Jesus wasn't always concerned about efficiency. Like he's doing this, he's preaching, he's teaching, and then he's like, okay, let's go to the other side. They go to the other side. There's this terrible storm that causes all kinds of problems, but actually leads to a deepening of faith among the disciples because they see Jesus control the weather. And then he gets there and he performs this miracle, and the result of the miracle is that they beg him to leave. And so then it's like, well, I guess we got to go back across, we got to go back across the ocean. So that's what's going on here. So when he came to the other side, what happened? One of the synagogue officials named Jairus came forward. So first, I guess it just says a large crowd gathered around him, and he stayed close to the sea. So I guess I'm jumping around a little bit, but isn't it a fascinating thing that he goes to one side of the sea, they beg him to leave. He goes to another side of the sea, and he's welcomed with a real sense of eagerness, a real sense of like, oh my gosh, this is Jesus. Like, and I suppose in some ways, this isn't really part of the readings, but in some ways we could ask ourselves, where are we at? Like, am I a person who's eager and excited to be in the presence of Jesus? Like, I want to be here with him. I want to love him. I want him to love me. I want him to notice me. I want to notice him. Or am I a person who, like, I sort of believe he can do crazy things. I know people in my life who say that he can do great things, but I'm not that interested. And so I'm actually begging him, like, Jesus, leave me. I'd rather live my life as I want to live it. I suppose we can kind of wonder about that. Be people who eagerly welcome him. Okay, so anyway, then Jairus, this synagogue official. So what's a synagogue? It's a Jewish place of not worship, but of prayer. So this is actually a really important thing, I think, and it's not really part of the reading, but there's a distinction between worship and prayer. So worship, or at least sacrificial worship, takes place only in the temple in Jerusalem at this time. There's no other way to offer sacrifice except in the temple, because this is what God has ordained. It's what he's chosen. And so when people want to offer worship, they need to go into Jerusalem to offer a sacrifice. The sacrifice could be animal sacrifice. It could be the sacrifice of bread and wine, which they offer the bread of the presence, those kinds of things. If I want to pray, if I want to gather with a congregation to study scripture and to hear preaching, then I go to the synagogue. And that's like my local community. So that's what a synagogue is. It's a place of prayer. It's a place of reading scripture and hearing preaching about scripture. It's like a Bible study area kind of thing. So that's the deal. So Jairus is this synagogue official. So he's prominent among the community. And yet this man of prominence, this man who knows the scriptures, this man who leads people in prayer, what happens? He comes to Jesus and he falls at his feet. There's such humility in this man that he sees, like, okay, in Jesus is someone greater than myself. So I want to follow it. I want to fall at his feet. I know the scriptures, and the scriptures actually point me to him. And so what a beautiful thing. And not only does he fall at his feet, but he pleads with him. He's like, Lord, my daughter's sick, but I know that if you come, she'll be well. So it's humility and faith. These two things that this synagogue official, this man of prominence, displays before Jesus, which actually moves him. It moves Jesus. I suppose in an interior sense, but also in an exterior sense, because what happens? Well, he went off with him, and a large crowd followed and pressed upon him. So, like, this is the wild thing. So it's like, okay, like, how do I get Jesus to move? Humility and faith. Humility and faith. That's how. I come before him, pleading, recognizing, like, Lord, but at the same time, a kind of confidence, kind of confidence. Like, what is faith? Faith is not like, gosh, I hope this happens. No, faith is like, I know, Jesus, that whatever you're going to provide is the best thing, and I actually know what you can provide in this situation. And so in faith, I trust that you can do something. And so I'm humbled before you, and I'm begging you, come with me. And he comes. Now, while he's going, this is where the story breaks up, right? Because while he's going, this woman with a flow of blood for 12 years. So that's going to be important to remember, the 12 years. This woman with a flow of blood. So a flow of blood, this is again, another important thing, that when it comes to offering worship, you can't enter into the temple with anything that would point toward death, that would point toward a loss of life. You can't enter the temple. So this woman who's got a flow of blood, she is ritually impure. It doesn't mean that she herself is bad. It just means that, ritually speaking, she can't enter into the place of life, which is the temple, where God, the God of the living, is. But if she has any sense of decay or death or loss of life, then she's ritually, which means for 12 years, not only has she been suffering physically, but spiritually she's been suffering as well. And it's not that she's happy about this. Obviously, it says that she suffered greatly, and yet she had spent all that she had. She's like, I'm trying my best. I'm trying my hardest to get to the solution here, but I got nothing. And so now at the end of her rope, or at the bottom of the barrel, whatever sort of idiom we want to use, what does she say? She's like, oh, but here's somebody again. Here's somebody who can heal me. And so what? She comes up and touches his cloak, and she says, if I but touch his clothes, I shall be cured. Again, there's this sense of what? Of deep faith in her. Deep faith. And what she's like, so normally if I'm ritually impure and I touch someone else, I am contagious. I spread that ritual impurity to another person. So people who are ritually impure, they had to announce that they were ritually impure, that they were unclean whenever they came into the presence of other people. They had to announce that. So she's like, but she's not concerned about her contagion. She understands that the holiness of Jesus is contagious. So when she touches Jesus, she doesn't expect that he's going to become impure, but instead she expects that his holiness is going to make her pure. And this is exactly what happens. Immediately, it says, immediately her flow of blood dried up. This is the wild thing about Jesus, is that he reverses things. You notice that he's not undoing the reality of the Jewish law, but instead he's come to bring healing to those who suffer from the consequences of this, we could say, of this spiritual slavery that we experienced before. Because why? Death is not God's fault. It is the fault of humanity cooperating with the devil. The devil holds us in his possession. He holds us in his company. And so because of that, he just continues to flow death and decay and loss of life within us, which what needs to be healed. And so Jesus comes along to heal it. And so then what? She felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Now this is kind of the wild thing, that Jesus, he felt power left him. He felt this. He experienced it. Like power leaves him. And so he turns around and is like, okay, what's the deal? Who touched this? And his disciples are like, everybody touched you, Lord. No, but there's something different about this. And what happens is the woman, realizing what had happened to her, again, just like we've been talking about, it seems like she's the one who reached out to touch Jesus. It seems like she's the active one here, when in reality, she is merely cooperating with the grace of God, which is the more active thing. That the grace of God acts upon her. And so she's like, no, this I didn't do this, but this happened to me. She recognized what happened, and so she approached in fear and trembling, which is what? Humility. Just like with Jairus. What happens? He approaches in humility and in faith. Now this woman, in faith, she goes to touch Jesus, confident that he can heal her, just touching the tassel of his cloak, of his clothes. And then in humility, she comes in fear and trembling, telling what happened, telling Jesus the whole truth. And so what does Jesus say? He says, daughter, your faith has saved you. So the story begins with Jairus, and we're going to get to him in a minute. The story begins with Jairus saying, Jesus, my daughter who is sick, is very sick. She needs your help. And at the end of the story, we find out that she is what? That she's 12 years old. And in between those two bookends, we have this woman who Jesus calls daughter and who had herself been afflicted for 12 years. So there's this really neat connection here that Jesus sees in this woman something of a fulfillment of Jairus' daughter. In himself, he calls her daughter. Like this is what a neat thing that Jesus calls her like his spiritual daughter. Beautiful. Lovely. Okay, so now we get back to the story. So while he was still speaking, people from the synagogue's house arrive and they're like, okay, she died. Don't bother. Like, don't trouble him. He's got other things to do. But remember, Jesus is not concerned about efficiency. And so what does he say? He's like, okay, just like forget about this. Like, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Just have faith. If you remember last week, the calming of the storm at sea, they're terrified because of the storm. Jesus responds by saying, why are you scared? Don't be afraid. So here he's saying, do not be afraid, just have faith. Maintain, remember that faith, Jairus, that you had at the beginning of this passage. Remember that faith. Keep it. Cling to it. And so what? They come, except what? He doesn't allow anyone except these three, Peter, James, and John. This is kind of an interesting thing that there are some times where Jesus only brings with him these three guys. And it's always these three guys. Peter, James, and John. When the transfiguration comes, Jesus goes up the mountain. He brings Peter, James, and John. When he goes into the garden to pray, he brings all of them, but then he goes further and he brings with him Peter, James, and John. So these three, it's like this kind of inner circle of Jesus, which maybe I suppose feels uncomfortable for us to talk about, that Jesus has an inner circle. But at the same time, I don't know, it's what the Bible reveals, and so we just kind of gotta take it in faith. So anyway, so he brings them. They see the commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly, and he says, the child is not dead, but asleep. And now talking about death as sleep, this is kind of an interesting thing. If you read the story of Lazarus, I think it's in like John chapter 11, if you read the story of Lazarus, what happens? Lazarus is sick to the point of death, but Jesus says that he is sleeping. And then the disciples don't understand, like, well, if he's just sleeping, he'll wake up. It's not a big deal. So then Jesus realized, okay, I got to be more clear. No, he's dead. So Jesus talks in this way, like, but he kind of makes a similarity, I suppose, or just like he interchanges whether talking about death or talking about sleep. And I suppose he speaks of sleep because why? Because he knows that he's about to raise this girl from the dead. He knows this. And so this is why he said, like, don't worry. She's not dead, but she's sleeping. So they ridicule him. He puts them out. He takes the child's father and mother. So this is something I recognized, like, as I was reading this, that Jairus is only mentioned at the beginning. From that point forward, it's just the child's daughter. It's always just the child's daughter. So in other words, the focus here is not so much on Jairus and his faith anymore, but now it's that Jairus' faith has moved Jesus to focus almost exclusively on the child's the father's child. So now Jairus is no longer father to this child, but now he is what? He is that the child is the child to the father. So anyway, so I don't know. It's just kind of an interesting thing, I suppose, that he's not mentioned. Anyway, what he takes the child by the hand. He says, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." She is a child of 12. So again, it's like he doesn't call her daughter. He calls her little girl. I suppose because her father is mentioned. But at the same time, just like she was afflicted, just like the woman with the hemorrhages was afflicted for 12 years, so to this child of 12, she hadn't really been afflicted for 12 years, but this child of 12 is now raised to what? To new life, to life again in him. What a beautiful thing. They're utterly astounded. That's the response. They're utterly astounded. And Jesus, of course, now is practical. Like, give her something to eat. She's been without food because she didn't have any. So give her something to eat. What a beautiful gift. Okay, there we go. I don't know. There's so much goodness here, but I think the key here is the faith and the humility, both of Jairus and of the woman with hemorrhages, which leads to healing in both cases. Healing in some ways of different people, actually. But recognizing, like, okay, the devil has a stronghold on us. We're in his possession. We're in his company. And we need Jesus to heal us. And so we come to Jesus, not just like with empty show, empty ritual, but we come to Jesus with hearts that are filled with humility and hearts that are filled with faith. Whew. And from that place, he can set us free. He can bring us freedom from the devil's possession. What a beautiful gift. Okay, I look forward to sharing our second reading from 2 Corinthians with you. God bless you.